All right, I'm going to put you guys over here. All right, there we go. Well, thank you to the small group for coming. I've given something in this format a few times, and so I just kind of updated it as well as we come into the year. So it's so the idea here is the design of our learning activities can potentially diminish, probably not eliminate, but potentially greatly diminish here. The idea is the low-hanging fruit. So if we think motivation for academic dishonesty is often an ability to put in low effort, by taking away a lot of the low effort opportunities, you're able to really increase overall integrity from your exams. So, I mean, the big thing, this is going to focus a lot about issues that come from CHEG mostly. There are tools, there are paraphrasers to get around plagiarism detection. Real-time chat collaboration design offers some protection, not a whole lot. Ringers. I've often joked that the biggest protection against a ringer in an online class to take your exam is the fact that the economic profile of our households aren't the same as other institutions. If I worked at a wealthier institution, I would probably be a lot more concerned about that. So most of it comes around CHEG. So, I mean, CHEG will solve uploaded problems. I think student membership is about 20 questions per month is what they're allowed to upload, as well as the searchable database of prior solved questions. But I think one of the biggest challenges is even changing up your questions. Depending on the subjects, answers of significant quality can pop up within minutes. I know John's actually experienced that, and I have as well. So in a testing environment, people post questions and answers can come up pretty quickly. This is a big function of what you teach as well. And so if you're teaching sort of less common classes, some boutique classes, CHEG just isn't going to work as well. I even noticed within economics, the quality of CHEG answers were really quite good in money and banking and a lot of principles courses. But my colleague Saeed teaches a managerial course, and I noticed a lot of the answers there were actually significantly wrong or just incomplete. So I think the quality can definitely depend on it. So I'm just really discussing course policies and management issues you want to consider, as well as online exam design if you're pushing out an exam. We were just talking, I've already set up my class that my exams and everything is going to be pushed out online. I'm going to live stream and record the Zoom class, as well as teach face-to-face in these few weeks, because there's just going to be too many students out. And in that particular class with 150 students, I'm not going to be able to adjudicate who's there and who's not and trying to get makeup. So basically this coming semester, I've almost given up on a face-to-face exam experience, even though I'm teaching a face-to-face class. I think it's just going to be too difficult to handle makeups and things like that. So make sure you set up with clear guidelines about academic dishonesty. So we'll talk about what those might look like. Checking for violations and enforcing your policy, and then also protecting your intellectual property in the first place. So trying to make sure your stuff isn't out there and having it taken down if it is out there. Oops. Oh. I can't go, do I go previous here? How do I go back? Page down. Nope, page down. There we go. All right, sorry about that. So there's a college policy and there's some required language you put in your syllabus. I would notice if you have your syllabus too, if you put in a hyperlink, the website address for the academic integrity policy has changed a little bit when we updated the policy. So if you do link it in your syllabus, you just want to make sure that's updated. So there's a college policy, but I think it's really helpful to interpret that policy in your course. So what constitutes cheating and what punishments will occur? For example, anything that comes outside of your course, you expect to see a citation, for example. And I often repeat that within instructions. So my exams have an instruction that says you cannot consult others for this exam. You cannot do this or that as well. So I didn't know that this would be considered cheating in the class is not really, should never be a low-hanging excuse that students can use, that this was just a misunderstanding. You want to make sure it's not. Because there are different levels. And so this is just an example of the text that I've had in my syllabus. right? And I talk about escalating, the following academic penalties, and they're going to escalate: a 0 on a question, a 0 on that particular assignment, a failing grade in the course. And then seriousness and frequency will kind of dictating that. And then I talk about what are offenses, lifting work without citation, right? Inappropriate collaboration. And I talk about what that is. I specifically have referenced, I've had a lot of issues with Chegg in academics, so I've specifically referenced it. Not only using it, but uploading it. So there's really sort of two ways. Someone who uploads and then uses an answer really almost commits two different offenses. They swipe the intellectual property, and then they have inappropriate assistance on their graded work as well. And then I think it's really important we report to the dean. I think, obviously academic integrity issues are just really underreported. Right? Math and economics account for like 75% of the reports that go to class, from what Paul tells me. So I think it's just underreported substantially. So typically what I've done is I've run through questions before deploying an assignment or an exam. With multiple choice questions, that can be a lot of work. So I often just spot check them. And if I spot check them and start finding a problem, then I know I have to search a little bit more. But lots of times when I answer questions and there's 5 essay questions or something like that, I just kind of stick them in Google and see if they're popping up somewhere. They'll pop up in Chegg or wherever else. So you check before, and then of course, that way you want to know when you deploy an exam that past classes, if you've reused questions, or past students aren't the ones who've actually uploaded it. So if it checks out, you also want to look after. I would notice something my colleague Glenn actually noticed, which is a little odd, is he found out that after he handed back a solution set to problem sets this past semester, it would appear on Chegg. So in other words, the students in his class weren't using it to answer the problem set. They were basically paying it forward by uploading a solution set for future students, which is, somewhat thoughtful, but not really the way we want to go, right? So you check before, you check after. Students often post to Chegg using screenshots. So it can take a day or two for the screenshot, for their bots to take the screenshot and turn it into text that becomes searchable as well. So, and then, to catch it in there is really the grade by question feature in Blackboard, or grade by question if you have them in papers, is really where the patterns come up, where you can see that a question was out there and a significant amount of students essentially access that resource as well. Again, following through and reporting to the dean is really important, because I think students will say, this is not me, I've never done this before, please don't report it to the dean. If they've never done it before, the screenshot included the copyright notice. Yeah, so Chegg's really checking for those too, aren't they? Right? They take it very, very seriously. So yes, and actually some faculty have reported they have screenshots of Chegg, and there's like this red kind of banner at the top saying, you may not post this to Chegg, this is private property, and the screenshot still winds up there as well. But following through with the report to the dean, so we have a better sense of it as an institutional problem and repeat offenders, is just really important. Here's just a question. This is just an example of some of the communication that I sent. Oh, and if anyone wants this PowerPoint later, I'll get the link and stick it in the chat a little bit later here. But this is just kind of an example of the email. So often I teach asynchronous online courses a lot. And so this is an example here. So email will be my primary communication, not a face-to-face meeting or a Zoom meeting typically about these things. So this is really me telling them, essentially your initial conversation with the student about what I found, right? And why this violates policy, right? And then I actually use, from the actual policy, I use the fact that the important component is students are entitled to an opportunity to explain to you what they feel happened, their understanding of whether or not this constitutes dishonesty and what they did, or what explains what you've noticed on their graded work, right? And so students might come back and say, well, I didn't know that was wrong, or I started this last minute, and well, this was just really hard. And that opens the conversation about, well, maybe we would start it early, and when it is hard, what resources are available, et cetera. But, in the process to go forward, students had to have had an opportunity to discuss it with you before it gets forwarded to the dean's office. So Chegg Honor Code will actually, when you find content on Chegg, Chegg's Honor Code will actually look up who submitted it and who used it. And you get like a spreadsheet report. And there's the dates of upload, there's dates of access, there's the IP address, there's the email address they used. Some students use their Oswego email address, some do not. So, but often ways to kind of narrow down when it got uploaded and who might have uploaded it. And I would just note that Paul Tomaszek has already actually written a letter on Oswego letterhead for me. It's a Word document, and you just have to insert your course and what you're looking for and the URLs, et cetera. And it's already signed by him. So I have it as a Word file, and I just change the specifics and go on. And Paul's given me blanket permission to share that with anyone who would like the honor code request as well. Honor code requests take a few days as well. Blackboard has the IP address that submitted things. So how can we use the IP address? So when Chegg reports the IP address and you have the IP address of submission, so if those can match, particularly if they're off campus. So on campus IP address don't have a whole lot of information for us, but an off campus IP address actually kind of goes to a location, to an apartment or a house that's being rented or et cetera. So if you have particularly an off-campus IP address where the submission is actually of the exam is matching the Chegg submission, then you have a really solid piece of where it came from. Because as you encountered, Magdalena, people don't always use their email addresses, and we can't always track them down really well that way, right? Because they'll use Proton Mail if they're smart enough, right? Or something that's anonymous. But an IP address is another piece of identifying information because Blackboard will record the IP address of submission. And then I would just encourage when people do find this to follow through and submit a takedown request under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. So it's a DMCA takedown request. Chegg actually now has a website, and you can actually just type it all in. You can paste in the URLs and then just submit it to them. You don't even have to email them. So I know Chegg Honor Code will take an email, or they will take this fillable form on their site. And typically what I do when I'm doing my regular search is I'll have a Google document open, and I'll just start putting the URLs in the Google Doc until I'm ready to submit the request that has a bunch of them as well. DMCA takes about 24 hours, I've noticed, even over weekends. So they're actually pretty quick to take down this content as well. And I will shout out to Chegg, even though they're being sued and I'm not really a fan. I would say other places like Study Blue or Course Hero, they don't have an honor code. Like they won't give you any information about who uploads what. They will not do it. So Chegg is, I'm aware, the only one that'll actually give you that information. All of them have to honor a takedown request, but in terms of figuring out who uploaded something, I think Chegg is really one of the only ones that will go to that effort. So let's turn our attention to design from the how-to, because the best way is to just prevent it rather than deal with it. Because those of us who have dealt to it know that it's just a time suck as well. So, course discipline, class size dictates the use of exams. I mentioned I'm just pushing exams online, mostly because I'm worried about students in and out of class and quarantines and things like that as well. But by pushing exams online in my big class, I'm going to have 4 exams during the semester. Instead of this midterm final design, I'm going to have 4 exams and a final. And again, that makes the exams, each exam is lower stakes now. And so the incentive to try and do something becomes a little bit lower. Right? So the higher weight something has, the greater incentive there is to try and get help on it. I really have turned questions when they're more free response. They're questions on process, how important it is to show work. And showing work, particularly when you emphasize process and referencing, that sometimes notation is the same across sources, sometimes it's not. Like in economic models, you might use some notation for something called the solo growth model. And if you're using a work where the notation is particularly unique, some notation is commonly agreed upon, some is not. And that's a real tell. When students post a response that's basically based on notations that you haven't taught them, that's telling you that they got it from somewhere else and it wasn't in the course. And that sort of begins the look or the questions about it as well. And especially when you reference prior work too, because that's not really a question you're going to post to Chegg for someone who hasn't been in the course to understand the reference and to be able to successfully answer that question. The same with current examples. You know, in economics, I can use an example about current data that they have to answer. And again, they're not really going to find that on a database of questions. They'd have to try and post a new question, but they're not going to find it existing because it hadn't happened yet. So. For bigger projects, staging work that builds on prior steps, again, someone can actually try and get the end product from another source, but if you're staging the work, and this doesn't have to just be done for semester papers, it can be done for, I think, smaller problem sets as well. Staging work that references their prior work, I think, again, is more challenging in large enrollment classes. It's easier to do in classes that are 30 or under, even on smaller projects, because you can trace back to the work that students have done. When they have to sort of reflect or justify, again, that's not something that question sites do really well in trying to answer as well. I mentioned the referencing, so I'll just skip through that. These are just kind of, if you use a publisher question bank, just know they're all out there, really. If you have any significant selling textbook, not even the bestsellers in category. I think any commercially published Principles of Micro or Macro textbook, their question banks are probably all in Chegg right now, right? Well over 50% of the questions, if not all of them. And then you don't own them. So because there've been multiple users across the country and even internationally, those questions, of course, wind up on Chegg because there's the potential for uploaders. The pool of uploaders is just so much larger, exponentially larger. And we don't own the content, so we can't tell them to take it down. In the past, I've told publishers, you know, I email the publishing departments and I have them take them down, but it happens slowly and they just pop back up because, again, there are just so many users of this content. So you have to wait accordingly. I think publisher question banks, I use them for practice. I said, you want to practice for this quiz? You can take this practice quiz over and over again, and they're basically feeding all of the publisher question banks that I'm not using, right? So my questions might be similar, but they won't be identical, right? And so you can use them for practice. You can weight accordingly. John and I use the Waymaker, and I do use the quiz package in the Waymaker, but I know a lot of the quiz questions are up on Chegg and sites like that. So I weighted accordingly. So I'm only weighting these quizzes 10%. And things that I create and have better control over get more weight. And then the structure of the exam can also minimize the impact as well. Let's talk about some of the structure of the design. So here's something I did. This is a funny story in economics. So I started this academic honesty pledge because there's some literature that suggests that when students take an honesty pledge or when people take this honor pledge, they're less likely to cheat in what follows. As it turns out, questions have been raised about the quality of that research and the whether or not the data was falsified in this body of research that was done. It was actually one of the authors was Dan Ariely. He's like one of the top behavioral economists. He's a huge name in economics. What is he? Irrationally rational or predictably irrational? What are some of his books? Anyway, he's a huge name. So it's been interesting. This has come out. When was it? When did this come out, John? This summer? I think so. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah.
So anyway,
I think it was like July or August.
Yeah. So, people start, someone actually looked at their data sets and stuff and realized, analyzing it, that the data was probably fake. And again, the data came from another source. And then I think the idea is Dan Ariely probably didn't look at the data, or maybe he wasn't careful about it. I don't know.
It's under investigation because what happened is it looked like half the data was duplicated, and it appeared to be non-random, that it was very structured in ways that randomly generated data should not be. Right.
So anyway, this is something I actually did because it was really in the literature that this could potentially help reduce dishonesty. So I don't know that it really does that now, thanks to those discoveries. But I do know it certainly helps you on the other end if you're pushing back at students because you have found it. So basically using adaptive release in Blackboard, they have to take this pledge before the rest of the exam opens. So I use an adaptive release and they answer this one question and they have to, or they can't take the rest of the test, right? And so again, it's very explicit. This is what you're allowed to do, this is what you're not allowed to do, and this is what I'm going to do about it if I find that you've done what you're not allowed to do. So while I don't know that research supports that this reduces it, I do know it can make things a lot easier on the back end if you're having to enforce your policies. I think one of the most effective things we could do is have a larger pool of questions. And so some of the more effective things require more work. This becomes easier over time. So when you've been at it, I'm in my 26th year and John is in his, what, 37th year, I would guess. And so, you know, we've taught a lot of, in our topic areas, we've written a lot of questions and there's a large pool. So I think this is something for junior faculty I could recommend that they start thinking about. Maybe they're not there and we shouldn't necessarily expect them to be. But over time, as you write a few questions, every time it comes around, every time you give this kind of assignment, you get a larger and larger pool. And then when you draw questions from the pool, students don't have the same questions. That means if something gets uploaded to Chegg, it's not necessarily helpful to the whole group. So it can minimize the damage that's done if an upload happens during an exam or an assignment. But it also minimizes the ability for students to collude because they don't have the exact same exam. And so it's just not going to work for them to try and sit down in real time and try and help each other with the exam. And if you add that to timing, they won't have time to help each other as well. And then the same idea as a pool is, you know, again, this is going to be easier in math and economics. I don't know this is applicable in other disciplines, but the calculated formula question, the numbers change for each question. You're drawing from a distribution and doing that makes the question a little bit different. And so now it's more difficult to collude and now it's easier to pinpoint who uploaded. We talked about the fake email problem and how to pinpoint it. When you have a large pool, you actually narrow it based on these questions uploaded, right? So if I have a big enough pool and only 8 people drew this question, I know I've now narrowed down my list of suspects to 8, right? And if there are other questions drawn from a pool, each additional question is narrowing down the list of who could have possibly uploaded it, especially when you've checked beforehand. So pools make it easier to pinpoint who is uploading, and they make it more difficult to work together as well. You know, timing is the big, I think, an issue. I taught online for a long time and I did not time things because I felt it was kind of antithetical to what online was trying to do in terms of access and the type of assignments. And I really had to kind of shift after my Chegg problem starting in 2019 to introduce more timed assignments. Not all of them, but ones where I think it's really important that there's not that kind of collaboration. Again, even though questions are answered relatively in minutes, timing can really limit the ability to use Chegg, right? It's just going to vary across. So depending on the time window, it really limits the ability to use Chegg. It limits the ability to collude, especially when you're combined with exams that are not the same because they're from a pool. You know, timing is problematic with unstable internet as well. You know, whether students get kicked off or not, you have to watch your settings to make sure they can get back in if they're being timed as well. I would just note for this group of this cohort of students, God love them, I timed the exam and then they said my exam timed out. I went to eat lunch and I came back and it had timed out. He goes, but I closed the exam. I said, well, the timer keeps timing. He goes, well, it should stop if I leave. I'm like, well, then it's not a timed exam. So yeah, I had a couple of those interesting conversations. So that's on the list of things you shouldn't have to tell your students, but you actually do. So in Blackboard, don't use force submit because if they get kicked off to the internet, it'll force submit. You use a timer with or without auto submit, you can decide. I think in a large class, you kind of have to use auto submit. In smaller classes, you could actually manually decide if someone exceeded time or whatever. The other thing I did for a final exam, which is longer, I actually divided into parts and the parts are separately timed. So if you're doing different kinds of questions or whatever, you can divide it up. And that kind of can also, it limits the frustration of maybe you're getting kicked off because internet is unstable, or, you know, I have to find this 3-hour block. Well, if you separate up the timing, they only have to find, you know, a block for this or a block for that, depending on the window that you've opened a test. That's especially helpful, I think, for students that already have extra time to begin with. So you have these timed exams and some students are entitled to double time. Dividing things into parts is helpful for them to get it in between their other obligations as well. I would just note that this is something I really discussed. I kind of discovered this with my students last year, and then it led to me doing some research. It's kind of a young research area, but there's a body of research that suggests that reading comprehension for the screen is worse than paper or maybe equal. There's no research that suggests that reading comprehension for the screen is better or faster than paper. Let me put it that way. So there is a body of research. And again, it's not huge and comprehensive yet. So I don't know how robust this result's going to be. So I interpret it with caution, but it was interesting for the research I did. They either found it took students longer, they read and comprehended more slowly on screen, or that there was no difference, but nothing suggested the screen was better. So in an in-class exam, the 1 minute per multiple choice has been an often guideline, for example, in exams, like in economics, but I would probably do 2 minutes per exam. So if I were doing, I don't know, if I were doing an exam of 40 multiple choice questions, I would probably time it at 90 minutes. When I was in class, I think I could comfortably time that as an hour, and I would not do that on screen. So I do think when you time an exam, you want to take that into account. The research is still new, but I think it points to enough that students may take longer on a screen to really read and understand the questions. One question at a time is another very effective. It comes with trade-offs, unfortunately, like many of this stuff. Some of the trade-offs are our time. In this case, this trade-off is the difficulty of the exam. So one question at a time, no backtracking, and you randomize the questions. This means that real-time collaboration in groups in a time exam becomes very difficult and very not particularly effective, right? And then of course, Chegg response time, because you couldn't go back to the questions, you'd have to wait for Chegg to respond, and you're probably going to run out of time, even if Chegg is responding and adding a few minutes to each question. It makes the exam harder. And then I don't know, and the one thing we don't know is that I don't know that it makes it harder in a uniform way. I think different students depend more or less on the ability to go back and think about their answers, or where a question 10 actually triggers something they remember back on question 3 and they can't go back now. I think that hurts. And so I think one of the most troublesome things is it isn't just makes it harder, it makes it harder in a way that's non-uniform. So just adjusting, saying, well, this makes the exam harder, so I'm just going to curve it. But I think it hurts some students more than others. So I don't really know what the good question is. I have done one question at a time initially when we pivoted in March of 2020 for my finals. But I did, in the past few years, I've gone away from it because I got a lot of negative feedback about it. They didn't think it was fair to them. I think there's a lot of students that think, well, I don't cheat and I'm being punished for all the students that do, in terms of a format that's harder. So in the past, I've said, we're going to give you all questions at once. If I find an exam that has some major dishonesty problems, we will switch format to one question at a time. So basically my behave or you can't have nice things speech is the way that what I would tell that as well. Just watch your results and your feedback options too. So if you're giving a larger window for a test, so if you're giving students 24 hours to take a test and the timer is going to start and it's going to be 90 minutes whenever they sit down and start it, but they can take it anytime in 24 hours. I think that flexibility is desirable because students have classes. Some of them are back to back, so you got to be careful about that. So I think, but at the same time, it does, students can take things at different times, and will they be able to inform each other what they've seen, and et cetera. So you just want to make sure that they're not viewable once submitted, right? And for auto-graded exams like multiple choice, you can actually hide the exam column because otherwise the scores immediately appear in Blackboard. So in other words, if a student gets 39 out of 40, they basically know they did really well on that test. And so the answers that they knew were correct. And that's an important piece of information they can potentially communicate to people who take it later as well. So again, that's the trade-off. I think, some people that take synchronous online may say, I was going to use the class period, so we're just going to do an exam during the class period. Everyone takes it in the same hour, right? And then you're going to have to make some availability exceptions for people that need extra time and have back-to-back classes as well. And then I think you have to just adjust the length of the exam. So if you're doing an exam that you would give in a 55-minute in-class period, and you're going to put it online, that exam can't be the same length. I think it will just be disastrous for students in terms of finishing. No, Proctoring Service is something people choose. That's what some people have gone with. I don't really think it's the answer. I don't think Proctoring Service on certain settings provides the protection people think they are. So people think they're protected a bit more than they actually are. So I think it's gameable at some of the lower settings. And it's like creepy Orwellian at some of the strongest settings, and frankly, racist. So at the strongest settings, there's facial recognition software. that doesn't recognize brown skin faces the way it recognizes white faces. It just doesn't. It's basically a private sector adaptation of military technology that's well known to have this problem. So there's, people with students with dark skin recording having to shine a flashlight on their face so that the computer will recognize them for the exam. That's the highest, proctoring software has different levels of settings, right? And so you can set them on things like this, and on the highest settings, it's, are people not allowed in the room? Well, sometimes our students don't have living situations where they have their own room, right? They shouldn't have to go to a bathroom to take their exam, right? It's kind of ridiculous. Or people often read, particularly people with ADHD or even dyslexia, typically move their lips as they're reading on a screen or even reading a textbook. And that can be flagged by proctoring software as talking to someone else when maybe no one else is in the room. So you have to be worried about that. It doesn't always work with some accessibility software, text readers and things like that, which is just going to be illegal if someone has that accommodation. And then there are big bandwidth issues too. So when you have to when you take it through a proctor lock, it can take more bandwidth. I think I've had students, I remember when we pivoted, I had a student and she was having trouble with another professor because he wanted it proctored, but she was in this area of Brooklyn where Verizon was redoing all of the fiber. So her internet connection was just terrible that entire semester. And the proctoring software was telling her, you can't take this, you don't have the bandwidth. And so what was she supposed to do? And it got resolved, but it was hard because she was a freshman. Unfortunately, she came to me and I said, well, you need to tell your professor what's going on and see what kind of solution can happen. I hate to start with an adversarial situation. I would rather say this is a policy. This is my structure that minimizes the possibility of dishonesty and then enforce it on the battle end. But if you set up the proctoring, it almost says, well, I know you're going to be dishonest, so we're going to have these hoops to jump through. If you've seen some of these instruction sheets for how to get into a proctor's exam, again, it's incredibly complicated, some of the steps to follow. So proctoring software is just not the solution that people think it is. Again, there's early research on that, but there's some research that suggests, and they compare the proctoring software exam to then taking an exam at the same time in class with an actual proctor. And some of these methods tend to show that the actual taking it under the software umbrella seems to lower test scores relative to taking it in the traditional proctored environment. I've spent a lot of time on Chegg. For written assignments, I think the other thing that can pop up from the internet is the paraphrasing tool. So there are websites out there and you either upload or paste in some text and they rewrite it, right? They use synonyms or whatever and rewrite it to avoid plagiarism protection. So you could plagiarize from a website. You could, someone could take a Chegg answer, then they could run it through the plagiarism detector, and they get back something that won't flag as a solution that was copied from Chegg, for example. The resulting response often makes little sense, especially if you're in a jargon-heavy discipline. Like in economics, there's certain terms you use to talk about movements or behavior of economic variables. And if you try and use a thesaurus-type synonym, it's going to sound really weird. So often paraphrasing tools often out themselves. Here's one of my favorite examples. So this is the answer from Chegg, which was unfortunately a really good answer. So it was about expected inflation on treasury bill yields, right? It says expectation of the rise in inflation will lead to a drop in the price of treasury bonds. This is because the required yield by the investors will increase in order to generate higher returns after beating the inflationary pressure, right there. And so you can see that what the paraphraser did. Desire for the ascend and the expansion will prompt a drop in the cost of the treasury bonds, right? So no economist talks like that ever, right? So you read this and you're like, what is this person doing? And yeah, so I think they can pop out in a jargon heavy field where there's certain ways that you talk about the behavior of certain things. These really pop out is pretty bad. You read it, you're like, that made no sense. Why would you even talk about it that way? And that's usually a good. Now, tracing back to the paraphraser source, I think is very difficult. There's a lot of paraphrasers out there and they'll work a little differently. So there's a few solutions. One of them you grade as is. It's like, this is poorly written, this is disorganized, this is unclear, this makes no sense. This is not really explained as the way, this is not using the correct terminology. There's a lot of things you can write as you feedback an assignment. Typically, I might follow up with a student about word choices. I'm like, well, why would you decide to say it that way? Given what we've talked about in class or things like that, why would you why would you do that? And then, necessarily not being able to prove it, I'll still say, you're clearly using a paraphrasing site. The result is poor quality. Here's better resources. Here are better resources when you're trying to answer a question. I try and be, I don't try and be mean about this, because often I would have to say the offenders are often students that speak English as a second language. So it's not even just academic dishonesty that's going on. The previous example was because they were taking a Chegg answer and they didn't want it to sound like a Chegg answer. But in some cases, they're using these because they just don't know their English just isn't strong enough to try and rephrase from another source or things like that. So the paraphraser is I think it's of limited usability. I don't think it's as effective as a cheating mechanism as Chegg, as a dishonesty mechanism. I think the other thing is to make sure departments are on the same page of awareness and consistency and strategy in dealing with it. I think it becomes terribly difficult in departments where some care more about this than others, and some aren't even looking for it, right? So they don't have to, they're not finding it because they're not even looking for it, and others are actually really careful about it. So I'm fortunate economics for us to be pretty much on the same page with this, but I think it's a lot more difficult, not even just for junior faculty, but it's more difficult if you're the senior faculty and you're the only one policing it in your department. It runs into a lot of difficulty. The big answer, I think students, when I cut them for Chegg, and I know John has got this too, the response is, well, I've done this in a ton of my classes. No one's ever said anything to me before. It's never been a problem before. And well, and so because they've gotten away with it before, despite whatever policy you state in their minds, they think, well, it's probably okay. Anyway, here I have this: pressure your textbook publisher to file their own notices to more aggressively protect their content. I had, I've gone to an OER in principles, but one of the things I talked about the rep when I stopped doing the order was that I said, you don't bring any value added anymore, because Chegg has taken your content and answered it, requiring your book so I can have access to that bank doesn't really do anything for me anymore. And so if I'm going to have to create that stuff, I might as well save students some money and go to an open source as well. Chegg has actually got a couple lawsuits, a couple from the two big publishers. So I think it's Pearson and Cengage, I think, both have sued Chegg. I don't know where they access it, but they filed a lawsuit over intellectual property issues. And now shareholders have actually sued Chegg.com because they're arguing that Chegg was kind of marketing itself as a study site, but they were really a site making most of their money on academic dishonesty. And so they were misleading shareholders about the purpose of the site and the future viability of their business plan is what's going on now. So maybe these things will take care of themselves as well. And that's kind of what I had. I didn't know if there are any kind of questions, insights, other strategies people have used.
I have a question. I read the paper that John sent, and there was something about watermarking exam. I don't know what that is. It's somebody suggested watermarking exam material to make them more difficult to share with contract cheating providers. What does that mean?
Well, it means, so for example, you can actually make like Word documents or things like that have a watermark on them. You've seen documents that have draft on it, you've seen that. And that's basically a watermark, right? And so, but people have said people have written questions and they have a banner say, no one has permission, or Chegg.com may not upload this or whatever. And they still wind up on Chegg because it's all automatic, right? There are bots that are doing this. So Chegg isn't really reading that content. Okay. So, I don't know. I don't think a watermark does. What a watermark might do is give someone a stronger case, right? But you really need big players to take someone like Chegg to court. You have to either be a consortium of universities or what's happened now, publishers, right? Not individual faculty. Right?
And the watermark would be most effective for paper exams. Most applications of this involve digital work, and that you can't watermark it if it's coming out of a course management system.
Right.
And most of the questions are uploaded by students using the app on their phone to just take a picture of what they see on the screen and uploading it. And it does the conversion to text. So any imagery would be lost other than.
So I noticed that you didn't even talk about the screen, the browser lock, because of course they can just use another.
They can use another screen, but he mentioned screenshots too. And here's the thing, even one question at a time, a student could screenshot every time the question appears, right? And so then they got a file full of screenshots, and they could potentially share that with people that take the test after them, right? So if you do this 24-hour window for a 90-minute test, the problem is even at one test at a time, students could screenshot and then they could send it to a group that looks at those questions and gets them in advance, right? Someone's got to be the sacrificial lamb and take it first, I guess. Someone's got to be a bro for the people that follow. But, so that's, collusion, but I think it is problematic, particularly if you're teaching an asynchronous online course. You really almost have to give an exam in at least a 2-day window, right? It's really, you can't really expect students at everybody at 7 p.m. to be ready to take this exam, right? Students are taking asynchronous online courses for a variety of time constraint reasons. So depending on the course you teach, that's not always viable, right? When you're teaching a course that meets a specific time, expecting everyone to take the exam at a specific time can mostly work. I think the difference is for students that need extra time. But
another thing that that you did mention follow-up conversations with students. So I've seen that a lot. For example, in math, you can use some apps that will solve an equation for you or find the derivative or something like that. Sometimes what the student writes down is very suspicious, and you can see what comes out when you feed it into the app, and maybe it's exactly the same thing. So in that case, talking to the student and see if they can explain their work afterwards, is that would that be an okay thing to do?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
And then if they can't, then it's pretty clear they cheated.
Right. This is, and this came up when I was filling in his chair while David was on leave. Was that last year? And our colleague Mihai it was Craig. So our colleague Craig had this issue. And what came up is, you mentioned they were using some language that you just don't use in the class. And this came up, this person had a graph, and then the axes of the graph were using terminology that was not taught in class, right? It may be taught in other sources, right? But, and that was Kate. I said, can you explain why you drove a graph where you use these for the axes, when in fact, in class, you were taught to use these axes? So what other source did you use to come up with this? And, eventually the student just kind of copped to it and withdrew their appeal.
Finally, I wanted to see what people thought about if you self-proctor your exam. So if you're giving, a synchronous exam, and instead of using proctoring software, you require students to get in the Zoom, and you basically just watch them as they are working. That should require less bandwidth, right?
Right. So that it should, so it's not going to be the same bandwidth or the same hurdles as proctoring software. So it'll be easier for that. Again, it does, having video does take more bandwidth than just taking the exam without it. And then you have to decide, what do you consider the concerns? Because, if you say that and you say someone's eyes wander over here, it could be because they've got a source over there. It could be car comes by. So you're going to be dealing with a lot of that, of what you might see. You can Google and you can find students who have their setups, where they have basically another screen like way behind there, right where the camera, so they can look at, and so off Zoom camera, they're able to kind of consult other things with looking fine on Zoom camera. So I don't think it's better than zero. Is it more effective than zero proctoring? Sure, and I think it does, the kind of, you're right, the group chat kind of collusion you might be worried about would also be. And then an in-class synchronize, like you said, going to a site that has the answer for it, you just kind of run out of time. Students have limited time in real time to collude with each other as well. And the collusion, a group that colludes only exists, you need a minimum of one smart friend. This is what I joke about. And so some of the issues of collusion that I've come up with and even flunked, it was like, it wasn't even effective cheating because they were all kind of at the similar level of, economic, of not stellar, but probably if they applied themselves, could have done just fine, and went a different direction, and we're all kind of equally a little clueless or struggling about it. Well, it's dishonest, but it's not necessarily effective. So those kind of groups only work if there's at least one person who's willing to sort of share their human capital that way and has sort of a better understanding. So, and that's the idea of a lot of low stakes, because if someone's going to actually cheat to make a difference in their grade in the course with a lot of low stakes assignments, they have to get someone else to do a lot of their assignments. So it better be a really good friend or boyfriend, girlfriend, it's got to be someone who's potentially really close and willing to do that. But if someone has just one thing that's worth 50% of the grades and it's a one shot, it's a lot easier to find someone to just do that one shot, right? And so that's dividing up the low stakes.
I hate to cut off this discussion, but we do have people coming in for the next session.
Okay.
So we should probably end this one and get the video rendering so we could get that out. I hate to do this, but I'm going to have to close the session and boot everyone off. Liz will be happy to answer any questions about academic integrity issues, and just send her an email. And we will have a recording of this as well as all of the other sessions. So thank you.
All right, thanks for coming, guys.
And hi, Peter and Jessamine, and I'll be coming right back. And I hope everyone comes back for the session. Just join the same URL.
Okay.